The mystery is over. The tension has been solved. And now we know what President Trump's big announcement was that he had been talking about for days about making today. And as it turns out, it's not quite the big discussion that anyone thought it was going to be. In fact, it was a bit of kind of a downer, especially in light of all the things that Lindsey Graham and Senator Blumenthal said on U.S. television on Sunday. Kind of a big downer, but it also reveals that there is a real disparity between how the West sees the reality and how Russians see the reality. And we couldn't possibly have anybody better to help us break this down today than Professor John Mearsheimer, international relations theorist expert and professor of political science at the University of Chicago. Welcome back to the show. Been a while since we've had you on.
It has been, Danny, but I'm glad to be back for sure.
Man, and we are glad to have you, especially today, because I'd like you kind of help us interpret a little bit about what was said today, and some things also that Vladimir Putin says. We'll see how this all fits or doesn't fit together. But first of all, I'd just kind of like your overall take of what you may have expected based on what Trump had been saying before, and what did we get?
Well, I think what I expected and what you get is a lot of rhetoric from Trump, a lot of boasting, a lot of talking like a tough guy. But then in the end, he just doesn't deliver very much. And the problem that he faces is we don't have a lot of weapons in the inventory to give to the Ukrainians, as everybody has been saying ad nauseum for months now. And furthermore, we can't supply them with manpower, which is what they really need. And then he said, I'm going to punt on sanctions. They're not going to be sanctions now, maybe in 50 days. So if you sort of look at the threat to Russia that he's trying to deliver, it's just not much of a threat at all. It's just a lot of empty rhetoric.
Well, in fact, let's just jump to see what that rhetoric was. Here's kind of the takeaway, the heart and soul of what we were all waiting to hear. Here's how he put it.
We are very unhappy, I am, with Russia. But we'll discuss that maybe a different day. But we're very, very unhappy with them, and we're going to be doing very severe tariffs if we don't have a deal in 50 days. Tariffs at about 100%. You'd call them secondary tariffs. You know what that means. And that's the way it is. That can be more simple. It's just the way it is. I hope we don't have to do it.
You know, President Trump entered office saying that he would have this solved before he took office, after he had won. And then you had Keith Kellogg saying, well, 100 days, we'll have it done in 100 days. And then it was in April, we are days away from walking away from this. And then it turned out about a couple of months later, it was, well, about 2 weeks, I think we'll know. And now it's 50 days. What do you make of all these timeframes that Trump keeps giving?
Well, it's obvious they don't know what they're doing. I mean, they've made all these promises, they've never delivered, and here we are again. And the question you have to ask yourself is, where are we going to be in 50 days? Is the situation going to improve on the battlefield for the Ukrainians over the next 50 days? The answer is no, it's going to deteriorate. Are weapons all of a sudden going to magically appear in the cupboard for us to pull out and give to the Ukrainians? No, that's not going to happen either. And this whole talk about, secondary sanctions, all sorts of experts have said that secondary sanctions just doesn't make any sense at all. They're not going to work. The fact is that Trump has no leverage, and he's going to be as bad off in 50 days as he is today.
And let's look at those secondary sanctions for anybody in the audience who might understand. Explain a little bit about what those are, and then why you say they actually aren't going to work.
Well, the thing is that the Russians have been sanctioned about as much as you can sanction any particular country. There's not much you can do to the Russians in terms of sanctions. The secondary sanctions are designed to punish countries that trade with Russia, and that would include countries like China and India. And they're basically going to tell the United States to go take a hike when Trump threatens, to put these huge sanctions on both China and India and many other countries for trading with the Russians. They're going to feel they have the right to trade with China as they see, with Russia as they see fit, and they'll continue to trade.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting on Face the Nation yesterday, CBS News. You had Lindsey Graham and Senator Blumenthal were interviewed on there, and one of the really kind of provocative things that Lindsey Graham said. I know he's the big rhetoric, no power dude. But anyway, he specifically on that, he says we are going to have these huge secondary tariffs on China, India, and Brazil. Obviously, the core members of the BRICS team. So my first question to you is, you kind of answered part of it right there. What would those countries do? Would they have to make a decision? Because that's what Lindsey Graham said. This would force them to decide if you want to do business with America or if you want to do business with someone else. Doesn't this run the risk of making other people around the world, other countries, think, you know what, maybe we better go with the BRICS because that seems a little more stable?
Well, there's no question that all sorts of countries are interested in putting as much distance as possible between them and the United States. And given American policy on things like tariffs and sanctions, and even starting wars, this is fully understandable. But what's really going on here is that if Trump were to put these sanctions on, and they were to go into effect, if countries like India and China went along with them, it would have devastating consequences for the international economy. You just can't do this kind of thing. And they're not going. These countries like India and China are not going to accept these secondary sanctions anyway.
And so if they don't accept the secondary sanctions, and presumably there would be at least enough experts in the administration to realize that it's a gamble to make that threat, and then all of a sudden the other side takes the wrong course, so to speak, and moves against us, then that would harm our economy. Isn't that right?
Well, our economy is inextricably bound up with the international economy. So any damage you do to the international economy is going to blow back into the United States. And this is something that Trump doesn't want. You want to remember that one of the reasons that we moved so quickly to shut down the war against Iran after a mere 12 days was because we thought that the Iranians were going to mine the Straits of Hormuz. And that really spooked the Trump administration because they understood that that would have devastating economic consequences. The last thing Donald Trump wants at this point in time is trouble with the international economy, because again, trouble with the international economy spells trouble for the American economy. And this whole idea of secondary sanctions, of putting, massive sanctions on China and India and Brazil because they trade with Russia, is just, I think, not a serious argument.
Interesting about the reaction to this. So one of the first reactions I saw literally just right before we came on the air here, the initial response from Russian media on RIA Novosti was that Trump issues ultimatum on Ukraine. And they say, basically, they repeat the thing that he basically gave 50 days to come up with some kind of a deal. How much do you think Russia actually views? I mean, this is obviously not the state. This is just a media company here, but they use the term ultimatum because an ultimatum implies that you have the power to extract pain or do something really bad. But do you think the Russians actually view these threats as actual potential pain?
Well, I think a little bit of pain for sure, but not much pain at all. I think the Russians want to have good relations with the United States. I think the Russians want to shut down the war in Ukraine. The problem is that the Russians view what's going on in Ukraine as an existential threat. And as a consequence of that, they've come up with a series of demands, which Putin spelled out last June 14th, and which the Russians view as ironclad. They're just not willing to abandon those demands. And if Trump wants to settle this conflict diplomatically, he has to accept those demands. And he's unwilling to accept those demands, in large part because the people that he has surrounded himself with refuse to accept those demands. So the end result is that Trump has these useless conversations with Putin, and he sends Steve Witkoff off to Russia to have useless conversations with Putin, where we think we can get a ceasefire or we can get the Russians to cave in on their demands, and the Russians make it clear that that's not going to happen. And this leads us then to say that we're deeply disappointed, that it's Putin's fault, and so forth and so on. This is simply wrong. Putin has a set of demands. You either accept them or you don't accept them. And again, the Trump administration refuses to accept Putin's demands. And the end result is we are where we are.
And, I found it interesting, puzzling, embarrassing, maybe is a better term, that one of the things that was asked of President Trump in the question and answer period after he'd made his comments here from one of the reporters in the room was that, do you think that this is going to actually force Putin into a peace deal? Watch this.
Could this transaction with NATO be viewed as a step towards achieving peace, letting Putin know that now Zelensky has a little bit more powerful tools in his tool chest, and maybe that brings him to the table to achieve peace? Because I know that you wanted to do that.
Brian, that's what we've been saying. I think you might have expressed it better if you wanted to.
I'm just trying
exactly
to
what
that's a summary.
That was a nice summary. I think he's done better than us.
This line here that, I think this is going to force Putin into come to the table for a peace on terms that we want. This was voiced all last week in Europe by Ursula von der Leyen and several other European leaders, Keir Starmer, et cetera, on this so-called rebuild conference that was held in Rome. And I just don't understand the logic behind it. And one of two things is at play, and I'd like your view on which it is. Either there is profound incapacity that they actually believe what they're saying, that they think that if we give a few more air defense missiles or a few more long-range missiles from Germany, from Tauruses or something, that could change the dynamic. And then all of a sudden, from a position of weakness, Putin would go, oh, darn, I guess I better go ahead and do what you guys want. Or is it that they don't actually believe that at all, but they're fine just continuing on with the war? Which do you think it is, or is it something different?
Well, what's going on here, just to unpack what you said a bit more, is that the Russians are winning on the battlefield. Almost everybody agrees with that point right now. Right? So they're winning. So the question is, how can Trump, given the decision he's just made, change that situation? What sorts of weaponry are we going to give to the Ukrainians? How are they going to use it? How are we going to shift the balance of power on the battlefield between the Ukrainians on one side and the Russians on the other side? And nobody ever says anything about that. They just talk about giving the Ukrainians weaponry as if this were some sort of magical solution. Well, maybe it is a magical solution, but if it is a magical solution, somebody has to tell us in considerable detail how this actually works. And of course, that never happens, because the fact is we don't have the weaponry to give to the Ukrainians to solve the problem. There is no military solution here. So all you have here is this empty rhetoric. And your question, of course, is, don't these people understand that? And at this point, I find it almost impossible to answer that question, because it would seem to me, after all these months, that the Trump administration would fully understand what's going on here and act accordingly. But the Trump administration is now beginning to talk more and more the way the Europeans and the Ukrainians talk, which is in a remarkably foolish way. Again, if you can't spell out to us, to people like you and me, how we rectify the situation by giving more weapons to the Ukrainians, or giving them more economic assistance, or giving them better strategic advice or better intelligence, if you can't tell a story there, this is all like tilting after windmills. It's just hard to believe. But as you and I both know, this is basically what American foreign policy has been all about for quite a while now.
Tilting at windmills. Wow, that's unfortunately very accurate. That I think the latest example of that in the United States is the news last week that the president has decided to give an additional benefit to the Ukraine side. So they're going to up from $300 million in 2025 from the Trump administration to a whopping $500 million additional support for Ukraine in the next the bill that they're trying to get passed here, the next budget bill. And I haven't seen anyone in the West write about this and supporting the president, and it just puzzles me. We gave a $61 billion package in May of 2024 under the Biden administration, and we saw it made, not only did it not make a difference on the battlefield, actually, and there's probably a number of reasons why, but the losses on the Ukraine side expanded after that bill was passed and it went into effect. Their losses started piling up even higher in terms of territory lost and casualties suffered. But now then, this is a half of $1 billion that they're talking about putting. Why does anyone think that that's even noticed on the battlefield?
I have no idea. I just can't give you an answer for that. It just makes no sense to me at all.
And yet here we are. We keep going down this path. Let's move on to the one of the other important issues.
Yeah,
sorry about that. Let's go into one of the other important issues here. You referenced it a second ago, and that is how much ammunition we have to give.
The U.S. stockpiles. There was a pause in delivery of weaponry to Ukraine in order to evaluate, apparently, the U.S. stockpiles. What came out of that?
Evaluation. I mean, this was a very big, what we're talking about today is a very, very big day. And what Pete was doing, and me too, I knew what Pete was doing, was evaluation, because we knew this was going to happen. And now we actually announced it. They voted on it. It's all been done. So obviously that has a big impact on, when you say pause, obviously you're not going to be doing things if you don't know what's going to happen here. But we were pretty sure this was going to happen, so we did a little bit of a pause. But this is a very big event today.
So he didn't actually answer the question, because all the information out last week was that there was all these internal audits done by the Pentagon that said, hey, we don't have enough ammunition. We can't give any more, especially of the interceptor missiles and 155 millimeter artillery shells. So we put a pause on them. Then all of a sudden, yeah, we'll just take the pause off. And she asked him, about that. Well, he didn't answer that. Yeah, well, we actually do have it to give away. He just said, yeah, there was an audit. And then I don't know what he meant by they voted on it. I wasn't clear in context even what that meant, but maybe you know.
I have no idea. I don't understand what this pause was all about. I don't understand fully who's responsible for the pause, what it meant, and so forth and so on. I mean, for a while, everybody was blaming Elbridge Colby. Then they were blaming Pete Hegseth. And then the whole question came up of whether Trump knew or not. And his answers there were remarkably opaque. All of this is to say, I can't tell, what the pause was all about, who was responsible for it. But in the final analysis, Danny, it doesn't matter. You remember they had an earlier pause. These pauses last a short period of time. Then we go back to business as usual, and we continue to fund the Ukrainians. So I think the whole matter of pauses just doesn't matter very much.
I want to take a look at some of those, because I think that's a much bigger issue than Trump is willing to acknowledge, but we need to acknowledge it. And that is, and on a show I did earlier today, I showed some historical examples from November of 2022, where the U.S. was first in voicing alarm that our inventories of the key weapon systems were getting really low, and we couldn't afford to just continue to give them out. Then in April 2023, retired Admiral Stavridis again issued the alarm, said, hey, we're getting low on our inventories. Then, of course, you had, that's the one right there. Thanks, Gary. And then we also had, you mentioned Bridge Colby. I think on the Wall Street Journal yesterday, they're talking about how, that's the reason they recommended the pause in the first place, because we're below the level that we need to defend our own national security. And so he said, we're already depleted, as he put it there. Then there was, and Gary, if you can throw this one in there too, we didn't talk about this earlier, but it's really poignant here. You had in April of this year, the former National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, say that, hey, by the way, we were critically low on long-range weapons too. And check out what he said here about the effectiveness of it.
reason why we didn't provide them originally is because the Secretary of Defense and the U.S. military told the president that the United States did not have enough of these in our inventory to meet our basic deterrence needs for the United States, and said essentially we do not recommend or advise that these be given to another country. Over time, over the course of 2 years, we produced more. We produced enough to be able to supply Ukraine with somewhere on the several hundred ATACMS. I would just say, in closing, that we ended up providing Ukraine with a very significant number of these systems, down to the level where, again, we basically have no more to give. And the idea that they made a major difference operationally in the war has not been borne out by the evidence. So I think a lot has been put on this ATACMS decision to suggest, oh, if only you'd given ATACMS, the war would have turned out totally differently. And yet the experience of the use of ATACMS by Ukraine on the battlefield, I think, suggests that that is not in fact the case.
And now you can throw Taurus into that and Storm Shadows from the UK, and there's the interceptor missiles. And you see already that Russia has their capacity to put air objects in the air on a nightly basis are just massive, that overwhelms anything that has. So a handful more interceptor missiles simply isn't going to make any difference, but it will make a difference in the depletion acceleration of our own inventory. What do you think about that dynamic?
I agree. I mean, the ATACMS were long heralded as the magic weapon. And the idea was that once we gave the Ukrainians ATACMS, that would fundamentally influence events on the battlefield. That didn't happen at all. The fact is we had limited ATACMS back then to give the Ukrainians, and that remains the case today. And by the way, Danny, the Germans have just announced that they're not going to give Taurus missiles to the Ukrainians. Not that I think they would matter much anyway. Again, there's no magical weapon here or set of weapons that you can give to the Ukrainians that are going to change what's happening in the war. The Russians are on a roll. The Russians are going to win. And there's nothing that we in the West can do to alter that reality.
Yeah, and then you get to that word again, reality, because there's some people that don't seem to be treading in it. And here is President Trump talking about how other people were fooled by Putin, but not him.
I speak to him a lot about getting this thing done. And I always hang up and say, well, that was a nice phone call. And then missiles are launched into Kiev or some other city. And I said, it's strange. And after that happens 3 or 4 times, you say, the talk doesn't mean anything. My conversations with him are always very pleasant. I say, isn't that a very lovely conversation? And then the missiles go off that night. I don't want to say he's an assassin, but he's a tough guy. It's been proven over the years. He's fooled a lot of people. He fooled Bush. He fooled a lot of people. He fooled Clinton, Bush, Obama, Biden. He didn't fool me. But what I do say is that at a certain point, you know, ultimately talk doesn't talk. It's got to be action.
And I'm almost speechless there myself. I mean, what do you think of that? Has he been fooled?
No, I think the key point here, Danny, is that Trump fooled himself, right? Putin didn't fool him. Putin has been a straight shooter on this issue from the get-go, especially with regard to Trump. You don't have to like Putin's position, his bargaining position, but it's been perfectly clear from the beginning. What Trump did was fool himself into thinking that he could get Putin to change his terms of a settlement. And he has these various conversations with Putin that he says are nice and pleasant conversations. But who cares whether he has nice or pleasant conversations with Putin? The key issue here is what does he think of Putin's terms? And is he going to accept them or not? And this is what I assume they talk about to some extent in their conversations. I would imagine that Putin has told him what the bottom line is from a Russian perspective. But Trump doesn't seem to understand this. And this is why this charade has gone on for months and months. And we are where we are at today. Trump fooled himself.
Yeah, and I think that that's going to be borne out in the next soundbite we have from that same conversation. Because as I play this, refer back to the phone call, the last one that took place between the two. I think there's been 5 or 6 even since he took office. So there's been plenty of opportunity here directly from Putin on what he thinks. But on July 3rd, for sure, Trump is reported, according to the readouts on both sides, to have asked Russia again for an unconditional ceasefire. And according to the actually, again, both sides, the Russians in particular, were very detailed in their readout, is that Putin said, we're not going to stop ceasefire. We're until we get the core issues solved. Only then are we going to stop, and we are not going to budge on these. So he, again, to your point, totally told him straight up front what he did. But apparently he did it very politely. But he said, we're not going to budge on this. And then in light of that, you have Trump then saying that he thought we were going to have this solved 4 times.
I felt that we had a deal about 4 times. And I thought we should have had a deal done a long time ago. But it just keeps going on and on and on. And every night people are dying. A lot of Russian soldiers are dying, by the way.
I got to just ask, upon what basis could he possibly think he had a deal when Putin has, as you said, never changed his terms?
Yeah, and again, he never says what that deal was. Okay, they nearly had a deal 4 times. Please tell me what the deal was that he thought that he had. And of course, he doesn't tell you because he is blowing smoke when he said they almost had a deal 4 times. And with regard to this issue of the ceasefire, the Russians have said ad nauseum that they will not accept a ceasefire. Nevertheless, Trump and his lieutenants and the Europeans and the Ukrainians continue to push for a ceasefire. The Russians say that is categorically unacceptable. Don't these people, like President Trump, understand that that's just wasting one's time to keep calling for a ceasefire? Furthermore, common sense should tell these people that the Russians would be fools to accept a ceasefire. If you're winning on the battlefield and the other side is losing, why would you agree to a ceasefire to give them, in effect, a timeout so they can reconstitute their forces, rearm, and put up a better fight against you? If you have the other side on the run, the name of the game is to keep pushing. And this, of course, is exactly what the Russians are doing. And to go back to my previous point, it's what the Russians have said they're going to do, period, end of story. But nevertheless, we continue to push for a ceasefire. And this is probably what President Trump means when he said they almost had a deal 4 times. He probably convinced himself the Russians were going to accept his proposal for a ceasefire, when in fact they were never going to accept that.
And so what do you think that the Russians are going to do with this information now? They have been given this, what Ria Novosti called an ultimatum of 50 days, or there's going to be sanctions. What I would think, and tell me what if you agree or disagree or expand on it, that the Kremlin's probably going today like, that's it. That's all you're going to see, 50 days, and it's going to be where it is right now, because I don't think there's any difference. So how do you see the Kremlin reacting to this?
I think they're just going to continue to do what they're doing. They're just going to continue to push forward and win on the battlefield. I mean, I think the Russians clearly understand there's really no possibility for a negotiated settlement at this point in time, unless Trump does a 180-degree turn, and there's no evidence that's going to happen. So I think if you're the Russians, you just continue to soldier on and try to wrap this up as quickly as possible. And of course, at the same time, if you're smart, you talk in a diplomatic way toward both the Americans, the Europeans, and the world community. You want to make it look like you are reasonable. And I'm talking about the Russians here. They don't want to fly off the handle and use hot rhetoric. They want to use diplomatic rhetoric, make it look like the United States and the Europeans and the Ukrainians are the unreasonable actors in this situation, not them. So I don't expect to see much change in Russian behavior.
Well, yeah, there is one person that was really excited about today's announcement, and that was Volodymyr Zelensky. Gary, if you could roll that one from earlier today.
Thank you, General, for participation. First off.
The Prime Minister, is kind of funny because next to me was supposed to be
We had very good conversation with General just now, and thank you, General, for coming. And thanks. We have often meetings with you and your team. Thanks to your team also for coming to Kiev. Thank you so much. We are thankful to President Trump for his all messages and very strong decisions about resuming delivers for us, and we are thankful for bipartisan support. And of course, we had very good conversations in Hague, and we had with President, and we had very good phone conversation. We made some decisions very positive for both countries, and just now we spoke about air defense with General.
So you mentioned a second ago, John, that the Russians understand about the power dynamics here. They know that the West doesn't have enough ammunition to make a difference. They know that the Ukraine side doesn't have enough personnel to use them, even if magically they could come up with the ammunition and weapons at the scale that is needed. But what about Zelensky? Because he seemed very, very happy and content that he got these, but he has to know those exact same power fundamentals as well. So the question is he just detached from reality and like Hitler in the bunker in the last days of the Third Reich, or does he have some other play? How do you see that?
Well, I think anytime a leader gets into a war and the war goes south, it's rare that that leader cuts his or her losses and exits the war. I think what happens in most cases is that you hang on hoping for a miracle. I think if you look at the American experience in Afghanistan, we were there for 20 years, and it was very clear after less than 10 years that that was a hopeless situation. But we just hung on. And President Trump, who was the one who decided to get out, ran into a lot of opposition when he did. And President Biden, who actually did get out, ran into a lot of opposition when he left. And I'm old enough to remember the Vietnam War. I think had Congress not put its foot down, we'd still be there fighting that war. You know, it is very difficult when you have all these sunk costs to just abandon the enterprise. And that's what you're seeing here. I mean, if you think about the price the Ukrainians have paid so far in this war, it's really mind-boggling. I believe that they have lost over 1 million men. And this is battle deaths and badly wounded. And all that's going to happen now is they're going to lose more people. And they're going to lose more territory, as you and I have talked about on numerous occasions. It behooves the Ukrainians to cut a deal here. But the leadership just doesn't think in those terms. They want to hang on. They're hoping for a miracle. And now that, you know, the Americans are getting re-involved, or Donald Trump is acting like Joe Biden II, they're beginning to think that maybe they will get that miracle. But as you and I know, they're not going to get the miracle.
Yeah, and I'd like your view on that, since you broached that subject, because during this press conference here today, or this question and answer period, Trump did mention that again, and he said, "Hey, you know, this is Biden's war. It would have never happened if I'd have been in office, and you know, now I've got to deal with it or so." But with this action here, I mean, can he make that claim anymore? Because it seems to me like it would have already been the case, but now it's like, you own it now. You can't be blaming any more on Biden on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't believe he could make the argument that it wasn't his war yesterday or last week. I think once he walked into the White House and made it clear that he wasn't going to shut down the Biden pipeline, it was his war. But certainly now it's his war. I don't think that Trump understands here, or in the case of Iran, that once you jump into one of these wars, it becomes your war, and it's exceedingly difficult to get out. I mean, Biden, to his credit, went to enormous lengths not to get into a war in Iran. The Israelis tried to bait us into a war against Iran in 2024 on 2 separate occasions, and the Biden administration smartly did not take the bite, or take the bait, rather. What's happened here with Trump, and this goes back to the 12-day war, is he took the bait, and on June 22nd, he jumped in. So we're now committed to that war against Iran. And I think Trump thought it was a one and done. I think he just thought he'd go in there, we'd pound the Iranians on June 22nd, and that would be the end of the story. But I don't think that's the way that one's going to end. And I think the same thing is true here. He's jumped in with both feet now. You could argue he was only in with one foot as of yesterday, but he's in with both feet now. And if anything, right, there's no end in sight here. Does he really believe that this one's going to end in 50 days? In 50 days, he's going to give Putin an ultimatum. Putin is going to throw up his hands. He's going to surrender. We're going to have a deal. It's going to be a deal that's favorable to the United States, and we live happily ever after. You really think that's going to happen? I don't think that's going to happen. I think this war is going to go on. And I think the Russians are eventually going to win it. And when they win it, we're going to be in a poisonous political environment afterwards. We're going to have a frozen conflict where both sides loathe each other, where both sides go to great lengths to undermine each other's position, the Russians undermining our position in the West, and we trying to undermine his position inside those territories he's conquered in Ukraine. And then there are all sorts of other potential flashpoints in Eastern Europe that are superimposed on this conflict. Endless trouble is ahead for us. Endless trouble. This one is not going to end, and it's a pipe dream for Trump to think that in 50 days he's going to have a magical solution.
Do you have any sense as to why 50? Where did that number come from?
Who knows? I mean, with him, as you know, he just pulls these numbers out of his.
Right. His age may not have even known. Maybe it's a pretty fair question.
Well,
he
operates by intuition. As you know, he probably just decided 50 days is, reasonable time frame.
Yeah, I think that's probably the closest expectation. I want to pivot a little bit to the Russian aspect of this. There was an interview given yesterday, and it was published on the Russian media, where Putin was addressing a couple of things here. I'm going to show you two clips from that, but I'm overall kind of curious as to your thought about what is the bigger message he's trying to send, and why did he choose now to make these statements? First of all, he's talking about when he first became president. He actually admits that he was inexperienced when he first entered office and that he trusted the West too much.
On the one hand, the communist regime, and many considered it a de facto tyranny, and on the other hand, the democratic world led by the United States. And many thought so, including me. Oddly enough, I worked for so many years, almost 20 years, in the intelligence of the Soviet Union. I also thought so, that the main contradiction was of an ideological nature. But when the Soviet Union was no more, there was no communist regime, but the cavalier attitude towards the state strategic interests of the Russian Federation remained. Not just a cavalier attitude, but all of this was tied to an obvious desire to achieve some geopolitical advantages. Moreover, when I became president, I also did not immediately understand everything. I began to convey to my colleagues, "Look, you say this, but you do this, and here is the evidence." And I presented this evidence. They nodded to me and said, "Yes, yes, 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 everything, of course, we will now restore order and nothing." And everything is exactly the opposite.
So what do you make of that first comment?
I think there's no question that if you look at how the Clinton administration dealt with Boris Yeltsin, who was the Russian president in the 90s, it's very clear that the Clinton administration went to great lengths to accommodate the Russians and not to pick a fight at all with the Russians. There was the big battle over NATO expansion, and we, in effect, started to shove NATO expansion down the Russians' throat in the 1990s. Remember, Clinton made the decision in 94, and then the first tranche of expansion was in 99. But nevertheless, if you go back and read the documents, and the documents are now available, it's quite clear that the Clinton administration was committed to having good relations with the Russians. They did not want to antagonize the Russians at all. Of course, in late 99, Putin is appointed as Yeltsin's successor. And then in 2000, the Clinton administration goes away and George W. Bush comes into power. If you look at Russian-US relations from roughly 2000 up to the present, or 2000 up to 2014. 2014 is the year when the Ukraine crisis broke out. The Russians constantly complained that we were not treating them fairly, that we were not paying serious attention to their security concerns. And Putin himself gave a very important speech at the 2007 Munich Security Conference, where he laid this unhappiness out before Western leaders. But nevertheless, the West basically ignored his concerns. There's just no question about it. And I personally think that Putin waited too long in terms of trusting the West. A good realist like me would have understood what the West was up to long before 2014. But Putin was remarkably trustworthy. And you want to remember that he seriously engaged in negotiations with the West with regard to the Donbass. He thought that, negotiations could be used to shut down that civil war that had broken out in the Donbass. He was actually quite foolish to be so accommodating to the West. But he's now reached the point where he doesn't trust the West as far as he can throw them. And he's admitted on at least 2 occasions that I know of that he was foolish. He's admitted that he was foolish to have been so trustworthy when it came to dealing with the West.
Yeah, I think he did so here as well. Before I show you the second soundbite from that interview here, I want to interject one from yesterday from Senator Blumenthal, because he goes on to say that, listen, Putin is just a flat out thug, and the only language he understands is that of force.
The threat of cooperation on that score in sending missile technology to North Korea, as well as support for Iran that potentially could come from Russia, is a major piece of evidence why we need to be strong with our allies against this axis. It still exists. The success against Iran's nuclear program ought not to make us complacent about the dangers of proliferating nuclear arms. And absolutely, yes, we should be coming down stronger, not only on Russia, but North Korea. And our plan has to be to deter this kind of nuclear arms cooperation, which is why our working with our allies is so important.
That was actually not the clip I was thinking of, but that was still a good one there, because you see the mentality that we need to press Russia and that we need to deter them. And this whole axis of evil is real, and it's not just something we made up. What do you make of that?
Well, his comments about Iran are very revealing. He believes that it was successful. He, I guess, hasn't gotten the word that the Israelis now acknowledge that the Iranians escaped the 12-day war with a substantial amount of enriched uranium. And furthermore, almost everybody agrees they have the ability to reconstitute their enrichment capability to the extent that it has been badly damaged by the attacks in the 12-day war. So the idea that force solve the Iran problem is simply wrong. And by the way, we can add to this the whole regime change issue, because one of the goals of that offensive was to effect regime change in Iran, not just to destroy the nuclear enrichment capability. And with regard to both of those goals, we and the Israelis failed. It's just very important to understand that. And the idea that we're going to use force to push Vladimir Putin around and get our way, does he not understand that Vladimir Putin is winning on the battlefield? And as we've discussed here on the show, we do not have any way of reversing the Ukrainians' fortunes on the battlefield. So the idea that we can just get tougher with the Russians and this is going to solve the problem is a pipe dream. And again, to go back to Iran, where are we on Iran? Have we solved that problem? Are we going to live happily ever after? Of course, the answer is no. And this is why everybody's saying that the Iranians better get ready for another attack from the Israelis and probably the United States as well. So all of this emphasis on using force to solve all these problems has not worked out well up to now. And the truth is, it's not going to work out well in the future.
And if anybody is confused on that point, all they got to do is listen to Vladimir Putin, because if all the things that we've done to Russia over the 3.5 years of this war, and really going all the way back to 2014 and the Minsk Accords and everything else like that, actually going all the way back to 1999, which you talked about with the constant movement of NATO to the Russian border, they should be dispelled now, because Putin doesn't seem to be giving in to the pressure.
We proposed a lot in the area of strategic offensive weapons. In the area of everything was rejected, 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 rejected. Well, it became clear that until we declare ourselves as an independent sovereign power, capable of defending its future, they will not reckon with us.
So he seems to be saying the opposite. The more you push, the more we realize we have to get stronger and stronger. How do you see this dynamic playing out?
I think that's exactly right. I think that, one of the first things you learn in Strategy 101 is that when you punch somebody in the face, you have to take into account what they're going to do in terms of retaliation. And a lot of people in the West think only in terms of a first strike. They don't think of the other side's second strike. And what's happened here is we were very tough with the Russians. We paid their interests very little heed up till 2014. And everything that's happened since 2014 has caused the Russians to have even more doubt about our so-called goodwill. And the emphasis is that, and the fact is that as a result of this, Putin is playing hardball with us. And this is hardly surprising at all. And as we said a few minutes ago, it's surprising that he didn't figure this out sooner. And he chastises himself for not recognizing the need to be tough with the West. But he's in a position now where he can afford to play tough. He's winning the war. And as long as he's winning the war, all of this empty rhetoric of ours is just not going to make much difference. And again, we just don't have anything to do, anything we can do to fix the situation on the battlefield.
So let me ask you in the last few minutes we have here, where does this go next? And I asked that question in light of the fact that Europe is on a rebuild program, some allegedly $800 billion spread over, that NATO itself has said everybody has to get up to 5% GDP, that Mark Rutte just a few days ago emphatically said that, hey, we have to get ready for war with Russia. It could be 3 to 5 to 7 years, and we have to get ready right now, etc. And then this was the Russian media today. They seem to be on the same path, that they're talking about how Europe has begun to prepare for war with Russia, and so that Russia has to prepare for war with them. And the article goes on to continue to say that they also have to get ready. Where do you see this going? Because it doesn't look good to me.
No, I think that the future is remarkably bleak. I find it hard to believe we are where we are. The first thing that has to happen is that this war has to be settled. And as I've said on numerous occasions, I think you're going to get a frozen conflict. You're not going to get a meaningful peace of settlement here. I hope I'm wrong and you do get a meaningful peace settlement, but I don't think that's going to happen. And I think you'll get a frozen conflict. And we have to watch how that plays itself out over the next few months, maybe the next year. And then once we get a frozen conflict, the question you have to ask yourself is, where do we go from there? And if you look around, there's just all sorts of reasons for concern. There's all sorts of trouble in the Baltic these days, where NATO countries are, threatening to intervene with Russian shipping in the Baltic, and the Russians are talking about playing tough with those NATO countries. There's just so many ways this can spin out of control. And you see all sorts of evidence of Russian analysts talking about the need to maybe use nuclear weapons at some point to convince the West that the Russians are serious. There are a number of Russian strategic analysts who think that the West has forgotten that we live in a nuclear world and that this is a very dangerous world. And maybe the way to remind them of just how dangerous the world is to use nuclear weapons. This is an argument I did not anticipate coming about, but you can find evidence of it. And the people who are making that argument are sophisticated strategists. So you want to remember that if we get tough with the Russians and we push the Russians really hard over the next 5, 6, 10 years, and let's assume that we put the Russians in a situation where they're getting increasingly desperate, they may very well turn to nuclear weapons. Is this likely? No. Is this a plausible scenario? Yes. But you want to compare the situation that we're now in today after listening to President Trump talk with the one we would be in if he had been able to shut this war down shortly after he came into office. If he had been able to shut this war down, we would be in much better shape today. Because again, this Ukraine situation is very dangerous at the moment. And as you and I were just saying, it's likely to get more dangerous with the passage of time. So the fact that we are principally responsible for starting this war by initiating the idea of NATO expansion into Ukraine in April of 2008, and the fact that President Trump has been unable to shut this war down, even though he had a real opportunity shortly after he took office, and that we are where we are today, is a thoroughly depressing situation.
Well, it is. And I wish you had a higher note to end on today, but I guess we'll wait and see in the next 50 days, because if there's one thing Trump has shown, and he doesn't stick ideologically to anything. So who knows, maybe in these 50 days, he may come to a different conclusion or maybe get some different information. And there's still the hope until something bad happens that we can have a better outcome. And maybe Trump will find some way to use the leverage he has to bring this war to an end. But in any case, we certainly are grateful for your very clear information on this and your knowledge. Thank you.
My pleasure, Danny.
And always our pleasure too. We are going to be back again on, by the way, we're going to get kind of a Ukraine view on all this with the show. I think it's at 3:00 this afternoon, if I'm not mistaken. Gary, correct me if I'm wrong. Is that the right number? Okay, yeah, it is 3:00. Thanks. It's a guy called the Russian Dude, even though he's actually for the Ukraine side. So you'll see that. That's going to be on our show this afternoon at 3:00. So be sure and tune in then, and we'll see what the other side of this has to say. Thank you very much. We'll see you then on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.